Hey there! In this video, I'd just like to share the different tricks that I use to create 3D backgrounds for animations and comics. Let's turn a scene that looks like this into something that looks like this. Now let's get started. So assuming that you've modeled your entire scene and did some basic lighting, the very first thing that we should check is that we are using the Eevee rendering engine. Eevee is faster, and it's a bit more flexible when it comes to non-photorealistic rendering. Now, the very first Eevee setting that we have to set is the color management view transform. You have to make sure that you're using standard instead of default AGX or filmic. The difference here is that AGX and filmic are better for photorealistic renders and would often look more dull, but standard would have more vibrant colors. And another thing here is that if you're trying to match the colors from a reference, they often change when you use AGX or filmic, but would be very close to the original color if you use standard, especially if you're going to use color picker. And the next setting that we'll be using is Ambient Occlusion. So if you notice that the pillows over here kind of blended with the bed and that you can't even see the corners of the walls. So with Ambient Occlusion, you can see a bit more distinction. You can adjust the distance and factor. If you want a factor higher than 1, just click here and then set it to the value that you want. And then the next setting that you can adjust is the shadows. Make sure to use as high as cube size and cascade size that you can go. And make sure to check high bit depth and soft shadows. Otherwise, you might have stair-stepping in your shadows. Another thing that would help with rendering is if you go to the world settings, if you change the color of the lighting of the scene and the color of the background itself. Because by default, if you go here to shader editor and then world, you have a node setup that is more like this. You have the background shader and the world output. If you change the color of the background shader, it also changes the color of the environment and the lighting. But with a setup like this, where you have a light path node, and then the is camera array is connected to factor, and you have two background shaders connected to the shader inputs of this mix shader, you can have a different color for your lighting color and the background color. This is also helpful if you have a skybox. The next rendering setting that you can adjust is the blue. So this one is something that you can do in post-processing in another program, but the advantage of doing it here in 3D is that because you have HDR basically in your renders, if you have any value higher than 1, it's going to start to glow if you have blue enabled. So for example, if you have a screen, you might have to set bloom here in the render so that it would start to glow around the edges. Now that we have the rendering settings, the other thing that will really help with the look is the shaders. This is a bit technical, but I put the link to the file in the description below if you want to follow along. First thing that we can adjust the shader is the color itself, because usually you don't always have black and white for your lighting. Some of the original local color of the object still seeps through. So this is the technique called Half Lambert. Basically what happens is you have the original color of your object and you put it to an add shader and you add the original shader back to it. So this is it without and this is it with. The effect is a bit subtle, but it helps a lot with darker scenes. The next thing we can adjust is to make the faces pointing away from the camera darker. So if you notice here, it still looks a bit flat. But if we enable it, you'll notice that the faces pointing away turn darker. This is especially helpful for more cubic shapes because you can already see the difference here between the face that's pointing towards the camera and pointing away from it. Since we already changed the brightness of the faces pointing away, we can also change the brightness of the faces pointing directly down. So if you notice here on this table, there will be some angles where the surface underneath and the surface on the sides kind of blend to each other. This is what the effect looks like on. So if you notice, you can easily see which part is pointing down here compared to a while ago where it was off. And conversely, you can also do the same with the faces pointing up. Now with just these, we already further improved what we had from just the lighting alone. Sometimes what helps to cover up the boring parts is to add some color variation to the flat surfaces. And that can be achieved with this node setup. So this is it with, this is it without. It's a bit subtle, but if you zoom in, you'll see that it's not going to be solid colors anymore. You can also do the same with the normals. So this is it without, and this is with. So you'll see that there's this grungy texture at the edges of, or the darker sides of the render. The last thing that you can add is making the faces that are further away from the camera darker. Because if you look at this, for example, sometimes it's kind of blending with each other. But if we add some variation to the depth, we'll see that it's much clearer which one's behind and which one's in front. And basically, that's how I set up the shaders usually. I just broke it up for the purposes of this demo, but usually I would combine this all into one Uber shader. Another thing you can do is also push the lighting a bit more. So this is with just one simple sunlight, but if using a different combination of lights, you can achieve a better effect. One of the main things to consider when making backgrounds for animation is usually shadows are sharp. So what you have to do is in the light settings, you can just adjust the radius or the size of the lights. So if you set it to 0, it's always going to be sharp. But if you set it to a higher value, it's going to blur. Another thing too is sometimes you might want to turn on the contact shadows for your lights. This helps a lot to prevent from making the objects look like they're floating from the floor. And one more thing that can help with lights is using negative energy. Because, for example, this corner over here, normally it's just going to be this solid color here. But if I wanted it to be darker, I can just add a point light there and set the power to a negative value. Sometimes you can't push this to the left to turn it negative. So what you can do is you can type the value directly, or just with the light selected, right click and then adjust light power, move it to the left. So by default, instead of brightening stuff, if you move to the left, it darkens stuff. You can also combine this with the ranges. So since we want it to be darker and we don't want it to be sharp, we can just increase the ranges. And another thing you can also do is you can use the custom distance. Unfortunately, we can't control the fall off of Eevee, so we can't make the fall off of lights constant. The brightness here will also be the same brightness here, or the darkness. But what we can do is we can adjust how far the light can affect things, and that's using custom distance. One thing too that you can use is you can use spotlights to shine light specifically on objects. So that's what I did over here with this light. In order to get this harsh lighting over here, I created a spotlight and reduced the distance so it doesn't affect the wall. Because if I turn this on, see, it's going to affect the wall. But if I turn it on, it's just going to affect to a certain distance. The last thing that you can do to further push your backgrounds is to use post-processing. Normally you would do this in a different program, but sometimes it's faster to do it here in Blender directly. You need to go here to the compositor editor and then make sure to check use nodes. And in order to see what it looks like in the viewport, you need to go to the shading settings and turn on compositor to either camera or always. There are two very basic nodes that you can use here. The first is the RGB curves. So this is just to adjust the brightness and contrast of the scene without having to manually play around with the materials themselves. The basic explanation here is that the x-axis is the current brightness, the y-axis is the target brightness. So if you put a point and push it up, it's going to make the dark parts brighter. Or if you push it down, it's going to make it darker. And same with areas here over in the right. You push it up, it'll make it brighter. If you push it down, it'll make it darker. So usually what you would do is you would either make an S-curve where the darker parts are darker and the brighter parts are brighter than the normal. So this is it with the curves adjustment. This is it without. Or you would make everything brighter in general. Then the next node that helps a lot is the color balance. With the color balance, you can set the mood of the scene. So right now it's more in the afternoon, but if I want it to be more at night, I could just turn the shadows, midtones, and highlights. Personally, I find it easier to do this than to fiddle around with the materials or with the lights. And with just these two basic nodes, the color balance and the RGB curves, you can change the colors of the scene to better fit the mood that you're aiming for. So this is what it looks like without, and this is what it looks like with. Basically, that's it. Those are my tips for creating non-photorealistic renders of backgrounds, animation, and comics. Hope it helped and hope to see more artwork from you guys.